Well, we're on our last leg today. We're setting the stage for the origin of species, and we're going to spend some time near the end of this class today talking about exactly what is in the origin, and so that when you're done, we hope, you'll have an understanding of what Darwin says in his book, and then you'll be able to understand what this book has meant to Western culture, because it's certainly, in my opinion, the most important book written in the entire 19th century. Well, we left poor Charles near the altar as he was deciding whether to get married or not. Having decided to get married, he asked his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, for her hand. So this would be a very happy marriage. They would be married until Darwin's death, and so some 43 years, and then she would live for some time afterwards. So it turned out to be, although in a sense a marriage of arrangement, as many of these were, they had a deep affection for one another and had a very happy marriage. Also in that year, Darwin saw the publication of two of his important works. The first came out along with the official narrative of the Voyage of the Beagle. So this is the set of volumes published by Captain Fitzroy. It's a 3-volume set plus a big fat 4th volume that's an appendix. We just acquired this about several years ago now for the purposes of our exhibition. So Fitzroy writes the official narrative. This is the book that has all the pictures. Remember the artists that they took on board, the 2 artists. We showed you some of their watercolors before. Now they've been turned into engravings for the book. And so here is the beagle in Tierra del Fuego, the engraved form. Here is the engraving of the Fuegian that was drawn by Augustus Earle in South America. Although it's kind of a sidetrack, I thought you might wonder how do you convert a picture to an image on what goes on. And this was kind of interesting because this is the one that's published, and I showed you before 2 illustrations. So here's a picture of the little hut here, which is actually a separate thing, and then here's another picture of the Fuegian himself, and so the engraver then took these 2 things and made it into one image. Where the dog came from, I have no idea, but he was not part of the original set. So Fitzroy told Darwin that he could have a volume of this if he wanted, because Darwin had kept this diary and was writing a narrative. So Darwin gets volume 3, and he doesn't get any pictures. Fitzroy kept all the pictures for his own volume. So there's no pictures in this, and all he gets for a title is this, Volume 3, Journals and Remarks, 1832 to 1836. But that's the first appearance of what we now call Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, probably the most popular travel narrative ever written, or at least popular in the sense of more people read this than most other travel narratives, mainly because of the significance for Darwin's later theory of evolution. Now, Darwin's volume is much more popular than the other volumes in that set, so almost immediately they reprint it separately. So poor Fitzroy doesn't get reprinted, but Darwin does. And so now it gets a much better title, right? Journal of Researches on the Geology and Natural History of the Beagle Voyage. So we have this edition also in the library, and then in later volumes, in later editions, it will gradually change to the title of the Voyage of the Beagle, which is what it will be called on a modern paperback if you want to read it. So this brings Darwin to the attention of people, the popular public, who hadn't heard about his scientific exploits. And also, beginning that same year, there begins to come out the 5 volumes of the Zoology of the Beagle, which Darwin is editor of. And we referred to this a little bit last time. When Darwin got back, he farmed out all his finches, all his birds, and all his fossils, and all his mammals to various experts who then wrote separate volumes. And so, for example, Richard Owen, the anatomist and the fossil expert, was given all the fossils. And so he wrote the Zoology of the Beagle, Volume 1, Fossil Mammalia, and there's Darwin's Toxodon, the one that he brought back from South America. So we have this on exhibit upstairs in the East Gallery. Darwin gave all his birds to John Gould, and so John Gould publishes the volume on birds for the zoology, and this is where we see the rhea of Darwin and the finches that we saw last time. So those now come out, and there's a volume on mammals. I think I didn't put that in. There's a volume on fish. I should have put that in for our man tomorrow, but I didn't. And then there's a volume on reptiles, which has an illustration of one of those iguanas that Darwin saw. So this is a 5-volume set. It takes about 4 years to come out, but it, again, adds to Darwin's stature as a naturalist. And so he's now become quite a well-known naturalist as the result of the publication of these 2 books. Well, Darwin, Charles, and Emma proceed to have children, as people do when they get married. And his first son is William, who's born within about a year, a little over a year after they get married. And here he is in this photograph. This is a picture that's interesting for a number of reasons. One is William's attire. William is wearing a nice dress and some pretty pearls there. And this is just the way they did it in England. Until you got to be a certain age, you didn't get to wear pants. And so there he is in his dress. It's also the first photograph of Darwin ever, and that's because photography was 3 years old. So the first photograph was made in 1839, and so very quickly the technology caught on and people opened studios. This is one of those studios with a big shade at the back you pull down to give you a landscape, and you just sit in front of it. You sit for like 15 minutes in front of it, and so it's amazing they could get this picture. So that's interesting, the first photograph of Darwin. And then the other thing that one notices on looking at this compared to the marriage portrait is that Darwin doesn't look so well. Maybe it's because he's been sitting there for 15 minutes, but it also could be because he literally is not feeling well, and we know this is the case. As early as 1840, Darwin started feeling ill, and the illness consisted of upset stomach, vomiting, continual vomiting, palpitations of the heart, as he put it, and then just a general anemia. So he's weak. He doesn't have the energy that he had when he was on the Beagle voyage or in the 4 years since he'd been back. So he's going to have this illness, whatever it is, he's going to have this illness for the next 40 years. So it's never going to go away. So some interest then to the historian, what did he have? Because no one at the time was able to tell him what's wrong with you. So we like to guess about things like this. And the reason it's of interest, why it's more than just a passing question, is because it's easy to say, and many people have said this, that, well, Darwin has this theory of evolution, and he's got it by now. By 1840, he's got the whole thing worked out. And he doesn't publish for another almost 30 years, 40 years, 20 years. Okay, I can't subtract today. So it's going to be 20 years until he publishes this, so why not? Well, this is going to be a theory that's going to be received rather badly by a lot of people, and so Darwin must have been a little bit afraid of the reaction, and so he's kind of reluctant to do this, but he knows he should, and yet one way to get out of a responsibility like this is to get sick. That is, if you kind of get sick, well, then you don't have to do anything. You can just wait till you get well. And so the argument has been made many times that Darwin had a psychosomatic illness. He was sick up here because he was scared to death of what was going to happen when he published his theory of evolution. So that's the psychosomatic part. But we now know there are possible physical causes. We told you when Darwin was in South America that he got bitten by that benchuca bug, the bug that carries this tropical disease, Chagas' disease. The disease wasn't diagnosed as a disease until after 1900. So nobody knew about it in Darwin's lifetime. But once it was discovered and the symptoms were worked out, and then it was realized that Darwin had some of these symptoms, then it became a real possibility. And many people, lots of people right to this present day, think that Darwin suffered from a real disease. It wasn't in his head, it was in his body, and was a parasitic disease. The problem with that diagnosis is that while Darwin does have some of these symptoms, mainly the anemia, that's characteristic of Chagas' disease, the upset stomach and the vomiting and some of the skin problems he had are not typical of that disease. So maybe there was something else. So every year somebody writes, usually some doctor, we probably have some here, so don't let me disparage you, but there are a lot of doctors with nothing to do, and so they like to go back into history and try and diagnose people. And so every year we get somebody writing something about what Darwin was sick with. The latest one suggests he had Crohn's disease, and so that's the big thing right now, but most people reject that as well. So the fact is we don't really know what he had. He could have had a combination of all of these. We certainly know he was exposed to Chagas' disease. He could have been nervous about this. And so maybe there was a psychosomatic component to this. The only difficulty I have with that is that once he publishes the origin, it should have gone away, and it doesn't. So if you're worried about something, maybe he just got used to it. So it's something we don't have the answer to, but it may have been involved in his decision not to publish immediately, but to wait another 20 years. Well, they live in London for 3 years. They get a new apartment, so he moves out of his Marlborough Street one. So they get a new place, and they live in London for some time. But Darwin, perhaps because of his illness, and perhaps because of the fact that he really was a solitary person, decided to find some digs elsewhere out of London. London was very dirty back then. It was also noisy, and there was a lot of visiting going on, and particularly Darwin would be invited to all sorts of banquets and dinners and club meetings, and he was getting kind of tired of that. So he looked for a place outside the country, and they found it in this little house known as Down House, which is in the village of Down, which is somewhat south of London. This is a map. I just stuck this map in for fun. This is a geological map, a famous one, Smith's map of geological map of England. And on this map, this is a detail of it. There's London, and right down here, just between the U and the R of Surrey, it says Down. So there it is. So it's outside London considerably here. Nowadays, I suppose it would be considered somewhat of a suburb. But you could get from Down to London in an hour or so, maybe a couple hours. And so he could come into London when he wanted to, but he could be outside of it when he wanted to. So they bought this house, and I should correct myself. This house was bought as a wedding present from Darwin's dad. So that's nice. My parents never bought me a house. So they bought, and then Darwin himself paid to have this wing added on. That's where his study is going to be, right in there, and a couple other bedrooms up above. So this is a very famous place now, because this is where Darwin lived for 40 years and where he wrote The Origin. They have preserved the inside to look more or less the way it was when Darwin was there. So this is probably how his study looked about the time that he was working on his barnacles, maybe about the time he wrote The Origin. And these are all the manuscripts that people sent him, letters and journals that he read, and then specimens that he analyzed. Here's another view of the study. If you go there now, it's their equivalent of a national heritage site, whatever they call that in England. So it's a very well-run organization. So they've got his microscopes and his copies of his books and his specimens and his papers are all scattered out. So it's a place well worth visiting. The village is kind of a quaint little village. It's got a church, which Darwin was actually involved in, which surprised a lot of people, but he thought churches were necessary to a community, and so he got very involved in picking the new pastor when the old one left. And so it's a very pleasant place to live. He had a pretty good-sized estate. If you go there now, it looks like this. They have kept it up very well, and so it's a really kind of a nice house. So he lived there. He had a little exercise yard outside. He had a place for a greenhouse, and so it was really a very pleasant place to live. Well, in 1842, just after their move to Down, Darwin decides, mainly because he's sick. And remember, he doesn't know in 1842 he's going to live for 40 more years. So as far as he knows, he's going to live like a day. So he figures that he really ought to get down on paper this theory of evolution that he's got. So he writes in 1842, this is a manuscript, he writes what we call the Sketch of 1842. We call it that because there's another manuscript we write that we have to give it a different name. So we call this one the Sketch because it's short. It's about 30 pages long, and he doesn't give it to anybody. He just writes it out. It's not even finished prose, a bunch of little notes in it. But it does talk about the struggle for existence and natural selection and all the things that he's going to talk about later on in his book. So now he's got it down on paper, although since he didn't give anybody any instructions about it, if he died, nobody would have even known it existed. But nevertheless, we have it. This turned up in about 1909. Somebody found this thing. So it doesn't turn up until a lot later. Also about this time, Darwin encounters the man who is going to become his closest friend later in life, a man named Joseph Hooker. So I thought I'd say something about Hooker because he plays a major role in Darwin's life. He's his principal sounding board as he writes The Origin of Species. Joseph Hooker was the son of the director of Kew Gardens in London, a man named William Hooker. And so that meant he was a botanist. His dad was a botanist, and he was a botanist. And in 1839, he left on a voyage as a naturalist. So you can see this has now become kind of a standard thing to do. If you're going to be a naturalist, the first thing you do when you graduate from college is you get on a ship and you go someplace and you collect something and you come back and you write a book about it, and then people will know who you are. So that's what Darwin had done, and Hooker follows right in his footsteps. The voyage he goes on is the voyage of the Erebus and Terror, and we documented this in our exhibition Ice, which you might remember from last year, Ice, a Victorian Romance. We had this on display. This was a voyage to Antarctica, an attempt to discover Antarctica, and they got pretty close to doing so. They didn't quite land there, but they certainly saw some of the sights, and these are illustrations from that voyage. This one's interesting. It's they discover on this voyage what's the big penguin, the emperor penguin, and so this poor emperor penguin is being led to the dinner table, and not his own either. But look who drew this, a sketch by Dr. Hooker. So these guys were talented. They went on these. He's a botanist, but he draws too, and so he makes this little sketch. One of the things they discovered on the voyage were some volcanoes in Antarctica, which was quite unexpected. There was one that was actually spewing forth ash as they were there, so they called it Mount Erebus after their ship. So it was a very successful voyage. You might wonder why you go to Antarctica to collect plants, because there aren't a lot there, but there's a lot on the way. And so they stop at a lot of little islands, and he will eventually write a multi-volume set on the botany of the voyage of Erebus and Terror. And so that is going to establish him as a botanist. So he gets back in 1843. Immediately, he had met Darwin before he left. Actually, there's an interesting story. I think I have time for this. Before Hooker left, he had applied to be the naturalist, which means being the assistant surgeon on the Erebus, and they were on the docks, and somebody introduced him to Darwin, who was down there. So he met who is now the great Darwin, you know. And then, so Hooker applied for the job, and they said, the captain said to him, well, you know, you really don't have enough experience to be a naturalist on this voyage. And Hooker said, what did Darwin know before he went out? Which was a great answer, because Darwin was just like him, just a young grad, and he became a naturalist on the voyage. So Hooker was hired, and he did an outstanding job. So when he gets back, so they'd met before, so when they get back, they started writing letters to one another, and they become fast correspondents and fast friends. And it is to Hooker that Darwin first confides his notion that species might have changed. In fact, he writes a very famous letter to Hooker. This would be in January of 1844, and he says, I think I'm about to say that species are immutable, and he says, it is like confessing a murder. You know, what's going to happen when I tell people this? And so Hooker is one of the first people to learn about what he does. Well, he's still alive in 1844, and so he says, well, I seem to have some time here, so maybe I should write a fuller account of my theory. So in 1844, right after he said that to Hooker about the species being not being immutable, he writes a much longer piece, a manuscript, which we call the Essay of 1844. This is about 230 pages. So the little sketch, I don't know if I told you, is about 30 pages. So this is quite a different thing. It's written for a reader. It's written as if it could be published, although he doesn't intend to publish it at the time. But you can get a pretty good understanding of his ideas if you read this manuscript. Now, in this case, he takes some precautions. He says, he writes a little codicil to his will, and he says, you know, if I die, I leave 100 pounds, I think that was the amount, to an editor to see this through the press. And the editor he had in mind was Hooker. He lists other people in case Hooker won't do it, the other people, but still Hooker is his primary choice. And so if he were to die, we would have some idea of what he had done. But this is never published in his lifetime. It and the sketch are first published, I think, in 1909, long after his death. So Darwin's now got it out. He could presumably, having gone to the work of writing this essay, he could presumably have said, well, now I just have to turn this into a finished book, and we can do that. But he's really brought up short in 1844 by the appearance of a book that he didn't write, that someone else wrote, and it's called The Vestiges, or more fully, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. So this is, notice there's no author on this, so this is published anonymously in both London and Edinburgh, and this is a book on evolution, pure and simple. We know who the author is. His name is Robert Chambers. This comes to light after Chambers dies. He confesses, you know, after his death. I wrote this, although some people, including Darwin, suspected that he was the man. But the Vestiges, basically, it makes the point that, well, look, we've got this great law of gravity that seems to govern how the universe works. And he says, I think there's another law. He calls it the law of development. And he says, there seems to be an overriding law that suggests that if you have matter that's kind of all the same, as he calls it, homogeneous matter, by its own nature, it kind of separates and differentiates and becomes more complex. So that, to take an analogy from astronomy, if you start out with a big cloud of gas and dust, and it's swirling around, the laws of physics cause it to contract and spin, and eventually you'll end up with a sun at the center and planets going around it. You have this very complex system that evolves naturally from a much more chaotic system, and that seems to be a law of physics. The same kind of thing seems to happen in nature. When we look around, we always see that things start out very simple and they get complex, like embryos do that. So you start out with this little cell, and you watch it, and it, you know, sprouts a little heart or whatever, and it seems to get more complex. We see it in the classification of animals. We see that we have very simple animals, and then we've got very complex ones, and we can arrange everything in this vast scheme. There seems to be a law of development that operates everywhere in the natural world. And he very clearly says that animals start out as very simple things, and they evolve more complexity because of this law of development. So it's a real theory of evolution. And Darwin is struck, first of all, by the fact that, well, somebody else has beat him to it, although the author does not suggest natural selection as a mechanism. He's kind of a Lamarckian. So it's kind of like, well, these things just do this, you know. There's no real mechanism given for why species should evolve. But nevertheless, it is a theory of evolution. So he's kind of surprised by that. But what really surprises him is the reaction of the scientific field to this book. The public loves this book. It's very popular. It goes through a number of editions. But the scientists, the people that Darwin knows, like, say, Adam Sedgwick, the geologist they went with, they just lay into this book. And they think this is just an abomination, to use a word that they actually use. This is just terrible science. And the objections that most of these people have to this book is that this guy is not a scientist. I mean, you can tell from reading that he's something else, which indeed he was. He was a publisher. He knew a lot about science, but he wasn't a scientist. And I think it was Adam Sedgwick, said nobody should be writing about the origin of species that doesn't know how to classify species. So if you haven't done it, you shouldn't be talking about it, is essentially the criticism. And so Darwin reads the book, he looks at the public reaction, and he looks at the scientific reactions, and he says, you know, if I publish my book, which is right there on his desk, if I publish my book, they could say the same thing. I never classified anything. You know, I give all my stuff to other people. So I'm not a specialist. I'm not an expert in anything, and so why aren't they going to say the same thing about me? Now, we don't know that he says this, but we just surmise because of what happens next, the fact that he doesn't publish his treatise, and because what he then decides to do. So what Darwin decides to do, and this is in 1846, is to become an expert. Now, he doesn't just sit down and say this, but that's what it's going to turn out. He is actually trying to clean up all the specimens from the Beagle voyage. This is what, 10 years later? He's still got little jars sitting on his desk. And he's a very methodical guy, you know, so he can't bear to have things that don't have labels on them and that aren't properly put in their place. So he's got this little vial that's got these barnacles in it. And these are very strange barnacles. These are barnacles that he dug out of the shell of like a conch shell. And these barnacles dig little holes in the conch, and they just move in and live in there. And so they're very tiny, they're kind of parasitic and very strange. And so he digs them out and says, well, what am I going to do with these? You know, he hasn't found anybody to take his invertebrates. So there is no volume on the invertebrates of the Beagle voyage. So he couldn't find anybody to do that. So he wants to do something with it. So he says, well, maybe I should learn something about barnacles. Okay. And so he starts. He writes to Hooker, as he always does. And he says, you know, what do you think about this thing, this weird thing? And Hooker says, well, nobody knows anything about barnacles. You know, why don't you learn something about them? So Darwin proceeds to try and read about barnacles and figure out this barnacle. And then he asks people, say, have you got any barnacles, you know, lying around your house? Like he thinks everyone would. And so people send him their barnacles. He even persuades the British Museum of Natural History to send him their entire barnacle collection. I don't encourage you to do that to any museum. You know, if you write the American Museum of Natural History and say, I'd like to borrow a dinosaur, they're not going to do it. They're very fussy about this. And so Darwin really must have had good pull, because what he's going to do with these specimens, you know, is dissect them, you know, under his little microscope, and then he's going to send them back all broken apart and stuff. And so, you know, it's kind of unusual, but they did. They sent him their entire barnacle collection. Nobody was doing anything with it, they probably figured. So anyway, Darwin's inquiry that he thought would be a few weeks maybe, or a few months, it turns into 8 years. He spends 8 years studying barnacles, and he's got that picture over his desk. That's kind of what it looked like and what it smelled like. Everyone always complained that you go in Darwin's study, you know, and it smells like whatever they use for formaldehyde, and then these little rotting little barnacles. This, in case you don't know, this is a modern picture of barnacles. These used to be thought to be mollusks because they have shells, you know, but they aren't. They're little creatures that live inside these things, and they come in two varieties. There are some that live on stalks like this. These are the kind that you find on the bottom of ships, and then there are some that just fasten themselves to rocks. We don't have barnacles in Kansas City, at least to my knowledge. So you have to go to the coast to see these. These are saltwater marine creatures. This is one of Darwin's own pictures of a barnacle, and so, you know, there's the living part of it. So it sticks these little feet out and pulls in food, and this is its head, which is kind of anchored to the shell there. A barnacle has been described as a shrimp cemented by its head to a rock and then put inside a shell. That's kind of a good description of what it is. So in his book, he proceeds to, that he's going to write, he proceeds to sort all these out. So he classifies all of these, gives them all names, and puts them in genera. So he's got the whole thing worked out. He becomes an expert in classification, which he wasn't before. And so whether he consciously set out to do this, we don't know. But the fact is that by the time he's done, when he writes his book, no one can say of Darwin, and no one will say of Darwin, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. You know, he's not a species guy. He's not a taxonomist. because clearly he was. This book, if you get a PhD in barnacles, whatever that would be called, this is your book. This is where you start. This is like the Linnaeus of barnacles. And so it really is an important contribution that he makes. So what does Darwin look like at this time? We have a few portraits from between about 1850 and 1855. This is one of the better ones. This is actually painted from life and then lithographed by a man, T.H. Maguire, who did about 50 scientific portraits in these couple of years. And so that's kind of a nice picture, probably what Darwin looked like about the time he's halfway through his barnacle studies. His friend Hooker leaves for a while, so he's got to proceed on his barnacle studies all by himself. Hooker goes to the Himalayas, goes to India and Nepal, and when he gets back, he will write an account of his journey there. And we have this book on display. It's a beautiful book, wonderful chromolithographs of the Himalayas. And so I just thought I'd show you quickly a couple of these. Hooker, when he gets back, he brings lots of seeds and things back. And one of the plants he specializes in are rhododendrons. And rhododendrons were not very well known. There are a few, I think, that are native to Europe. I'm not positive about this, but most of our modern rhododendrons come from Asia. And so in this picture here, you can see the rhododendrons growing naturally there in the Alps. So when he comes back, he'll write a book about this, about his Himalaya voyage, and then he will bring back seeds, which go to Kew Gardens, and then from there to the rest of the world. Well, the big trauma of this period, the barnacle period for Darwin, is the death of his dearest child. Annie, born in 1841, she was the second daughter. Parents aren't supposed to have favorite children. I don't, of course. Or certainly we don't admit it to our kids, but Darwin sort of confessed that this was his favorite girl, very bright and alert and very good to her father. I suppose that counted. So she humored the man with his barnacles. And in 1850, she became ill with a disease that they couldn't treat. It was either scarlet fever or fever like that. And Darwin took her. He himself used to go to various spas around England trying to find some treatment for his own illness. And so he took Annie with him to various places. And basically, she just got weaker and weaker. And then she died in 1841. He was sort of there alone with her. His wife was giving birth to the next child, so she couldn't be there when he died. So it was very traumatic for all of them. He had to write letters to his wife telling them that their dearest Annie had died. So this was a major low for Darwin, and he says later that this was also the point at which he lost whatever faith he had. He wasn't much of a practicing believer. He still went to church and things like that, but he wasn't much of a believer. But he says that this was it for him. As far as a personal God who intervenes in human life, he couldn't believe there was a deity that would allow a girl like this to die. So that was sort of it for Darwin and formal religion. He got out of his depression by work, as he always did, and he was working on the barnacles. And so the barnacle volumes begin to appear in 1851. This is the volume on the pedunculated, the ones with the arms, and the other barnacles. And then he also publishes 2 volumes on fossil barnacles. So 4 volumes in all come out of this work, and as I say, it is a major treatise. We have this one on display. This is the only colored plate in the book, so most of them are just diagrams of the innards of barnacles and don't interest most people, but that's kind of a nice picture of the shells of some of these fixed barnacles. This, by the time it's published, this is a portrait we have now, a photograph of Darwin, so that's probably what he looked like. That is what he looked like, about the time that the last barnacle volume appears. So now he's got the barnacles done, so he could write his book, right? So sit down and write your evolution book. Well, he says, there's some things I need to know before I can write my book. And so what Darwin thinks that he doesn't really understand is the breeding of domestic animals. And this is relevant to evolution because evolution involves change over time, and what humans are able to do with animals is to change them by breeding, by selective breeding. So he said that's a very relevant thing. And so if we can understand how do we create new varieties of animals, then maybe we can understand how nature does it. So it's quite a reasonable digression if that's what it is. So he begins reading books by breeders, and he begins doing his own breeding. And his breeding animal of choice is the pigeon. So lots of Victorians bred pigeons. You can keep them kind of in a small space. Pigeons tend to be moldable, you can, if that's a proper word, that is, you can take pigeons and breed them. You can get some pretty weird varieties, and you can breed those, and you can get even weirder ones, and they're fun to show your neighbor, look what I got. So, for example, the pigeons that were common in Darwin's day were pigeons like the pouter pigeon. So this is a variety of pigeon that can puff up like a grouse, and was called the pouter. These are all the names that they used at that time. And these are from a book that we have on display that is about pigeons. And there's a fantail. You know, probably the pigeon on your back porch can't do this, but this pigeon, and some of these fantails. By the way, in preparing for this lecture, I was just out of curiosity looking up modern pigeon breeding, and it's still going on. And they're even worse. The pigeons, there's a fantail I saw on the internet that's got a fan like a peacock. It's just amazing. And so these are bred. You know, these are what breeders do is they pick traits and they're able to sort of create these. And then the final one here, this is a Jacobin. This has this little cowl of feathers, and so it kind of looks like a monk, and so that's what it's named for, the Jacobin monks. So these are all varieties that were well known in Darwin's day, and so what Darwin does is he buys some stock pigeons and he does breeding to see what goes on. How is it I'm able to make a pigeon like this when I start from a pigeon like this? And what Darwin will eventually come to realize, and maybe he believes that at the start, is that all these pigeon varieties, they all stem from this basic pigeon, what they call the rock pigeon. So this is the kind of wild pigeon that you see, and all these pigeons are descendants of this. And breeders have done this. They've simply selected varieties and bred them and be able to accentuate these varieties and create what look like new species. And Darwin says, if we didn't know all about the pigeon and we saw these things, you know, out in the wild, we'd say, well, that's a species, you know, and that's a species, and yet they aren't species, really. They're just varieties. And so that's what Darwin is doing, starting about 1854 and 1855 and 1856. And who knows? You could breed pigeons a long time. You could have done that forever. However, fortunately for us, and fortunately for Darwin, circumstances intervene. In 1855, Darwin reads a paper in a journal, the Annals of Natural History. He's recommended to read it by, I think Lyell writes it, so he doesn't stumble on it himself. So Lyell says, you ought to read this paper. This guy seems to be thinking like you're thinking. So Darwin reads this paper on the law which has regulated the introduction of new species. And this paper basically makes the point that when you go to an area and you look at the animals and you look at the fossils in that area, there's a connection there. There's a connection between fossil animals and living animals, almost as if the living ones have descended from the earlier ones. So this author has discovered what Darwin earlier called the succession of types, you know, which is going to be a part of his evolutionary theory. So who wrote this? This book, this little paper was written by Alfred Russel Wallace. So let's say a few things about Wallace. Wallace was a Welshman, which to an Englishman is kind of a term of derogation. He came from Usk. He came from Monmouthshire, which on our little map is down here. So he's barely Welsh. This is the border. By the way, Darwin is barely English. He's up here. He's on this side of the border in Shropshire, and Wallace came from there. And unlike Darwin, Wallace came from a poor family, or really from a family that used to be well off but became poor. So his father had lost most of his fortune. So Wallace had to earn his own way every place he went. He moved to England for a while, and in the 1840s, he's about, by the way, about 90 years younger than Darwin, born in 1823. So he moves into a kind of a semi-literary circle in England, and in the 1840s, he reads. He teaches himself. He never gets formal education. So he has to learn everything by reading, which a lot of people did in the 19th century. And it's interesting who he reads. He reads Humboldt. That's Darwin's favorite naturalist. He reads Malthus. There's Malthus down here. Darwin read Malthus. He reads Darwin. Darwin didn't read Darwin, but Wallace is later. So he reads The Voyage of the Beagle. So that's really excites him. He reads The Vestiges. He's not horrified by the vestiges. He thinks, hey, that's a pretty neat idea. And he reads Lyell. Now, I haven't mentioned before, I just didn't have the occasion to, but Charles Lyell, the geologist, and Darwin took his book with him on the voyage. Charles Lyell, in the second volume of his geology book, has a long discussion of Lamarckian evolution. So it's one of the most common ways that people are introduced to Lamarck. And Lyell's opinion is that, well, this is balderdash. You know, he gives a lot of reasons why species have not evolved. So most people read it and come away thinking, well, Lamarck wasn't right. Wallace reads it and he says, hey, that's pretty neat, that Lamarckian evolution. That's kind of a neat idea. So Wallace is much more receptive to these innovative theories about species change than others before. But he's not learned it in any kind of a formal sense. In the mid-1840s, he meets a man with similar interests, a man named Henry Walter Bates. And they both are readers. They talk about these books amongst each other. And so Wallace and Bates say, you know, we got to do what Darwin did or Humboldt did. We have to go someplace. And now they can't afford, they can't, you know, they aren't educated, so they can't become a naturalist on a ship. But they can pay a fare, you know, so they can go someplace. and they can explore on their own and then come back. Now, because they're not financed by their dad, there has to be a way to get money, and so what Wallace's goal is, and this will be his goal the rest of his life, is to gather specimens and sell them. After all, if you find this big Brazilian butterfly, you know, it's like this, there are a lot of collectors that'll pay a handsome fee for this. And there had arisen in England in the 1840s, after Darwin's voyage, there were brokers who would buy specimens. So you come back from a trip, you sell your specimens to the broker, and then they'll sell them around to museums or collectors. And so you could actually make money collecting butterflies and bird skins and things like this. So that's what Wallace intends to do, to go to the Amazon basin and with Bates and collect. So they leave in 1848, and here's the Amazon where they go. Darwin doesn't spend any time at the Amazon basin. So he basically goes from here down to here. So this is unexplored for Darwin, and it's unexplored for most people. There's been one guy that really explored it before. So this is where they go. They're going to spend 4 years there. They actually split up. Bates says, well, there's no sense our both collecting in the same place, so I'm going to go inland. So he goes up the Amazon, and Wallace collects down here. So I don't think they see each other again for the last couple years of the trip. So in 1852, Wallace, he's got something like 35 crates of stuff. You know, so he's made all these collections, and he's got all his notes. And so he doesn't have his own ship, so he books passage on this steamer, or it wouldn't be a steamer at that time, so just a sailing ship coming back, and the ship burns to the waterline on the way back. He loses all of his specimens. Everything he'd spent all those 4 years collecting, he saved some of his notes, so he is going to be able to write this up as a narrative, but he loses everything. So that would certainly would depress me. It would depress most people, but what Wallace does when he gets back, he spends like 6 months getting over all of this, and then he says, well, I'm going to go out again. I'll go someplace different, and I'll just take more care of my stuff this time. So in 1854, he heads off to what was called back then the Malay Archipelago. All right, this is what we now call Malaysia and Indonesia, but I'm going to use his name for it. That's what they used up through the 19th century. So this includes modern Borneo and Java and Sumatra, the Spice Islands, the Moluccas in here, and parts of New Guinea. So this is a modern map. This is Wallace's map that he will publish later on, and this is his itinerary. So the guy really went a lot of places. And the way he travels, because he doesn't have a ship, is he just, there's a lot of trading going on. These are the Spice Islands, so there's lots of ship traffic, and so he'll just, pay a fee and go from here to here, and then he'll spend a few months gathering specimens and writing, keeping his diary, and then coming back. So Wallace is becoming, he's a self-trained naturalist, but what he's doing, beginning in about 1855, is he's seeing the same things in nature, the same patterns that Darwin saw when he was at the Galapagos. That he's seeing, there's connections here. There's connections between the species in an area and neighboring species, as if they have some sort of a common ancestor. There's a connection between fossils and living species. He's becoming not so convinced that species are immutable, as all his contemporaries were. And he will later write a book on this, which we have in the library. We do not have this on display because it's after Darwin, but we do have it, called the Malay Archipelago. And so these are some of the things he collects. If you're a collector for money, then birds of paradise are gold, because the feathers of birds of paradise were used by all the Victorian ladies for their hats, unfortunately for the birds of paradise. But so you collect those, and here's the natives hunt them as well, because they can sell them to traders and make some money. This is a wonderful frontispiece to one of his books, probably an event that didn't happen, although he did see an orangutan, but it says orangutan attacked by Dayaks, by the natives there. I'm not sure who's attacking whom, but it's, the purpose is to sell books, and so that's why you put a nice frontispiece like this, because it certainly will make you read the page, turn the page. Beetles, thousands of beetles he brings back. Darwin would have loved this, because he's a beetle specialist, and this is one of those large stag beetles, one of those beetles like this size, which we don't need. And then there's some kind of laconic scenes. I love this one. This is this huge, whatever this snake is, and then the caption simply says, ejecting an intruder. If I went to go in my house and that was coiled around us, I would call for help as well. So Wallace is, by 1855, has this sort of notion of the succession of types. And so Darwin reads this, and he says, maybe I really ought to write my book, because this guy's going to get it, pretty soon. And so Darwin starts about 1856 on what we call the Big Book. And we call it this, we put it in quotation marks usually, and we call it this because it's not published. It's not the book he's going to publish. This is a book he intends to publish, but you can tell by the title, it was going to be huge. He never finishes it, But his idea, and you can't blame me for this, he says, look, if I'm going to present a controversial theory like this, then I need evidence, and I need to support. So I need footnotes, and footnotes on my footnotes. I need all this. And so what he starts writing is this very detailed study. And he starts by, because he's working on pigeons, he starts by writing on variation under domestication. So that's going to be the first chapter of his book, The Origin of Species. In The Origin of Species, that's like 30 pages. In this, it's like 500 pages. So he doesn't really get much further than this. So at least he's writing a book, and he intends to publish it, but he's not making a lot of progress. And over the course of about the next 3 years, he's going to write about 700 pages, but none of this is ever going to appear. What Wallace, meanwhile, is busy observing and collecting, and these are some more pictures, some more birds of paradise that he sees. And by 1858, I want to get to this before our break, so let me show you this. By 1858, Wallace is in Ternate, that little island right there. That's a famous spice island. It's where cloves originally came from. So all the cloves used to come from a mountain there. So he's there. He's got malaria. That's why I put this hut in there. He's in his little hut. He's got malaria, so he can't collect anything. So he writes a little manuscript, and he sends it to Darwin. So on June 18th, 1858, and I like this picture of Darwin because he looks like it's not really from that time. It's from a couple of years earlier, but he looks like he's just getting a shot to the head. On June 18, 1858, Darwin gets a letter from Wallace written to him. And in that letter is this little manuscript, about a 6-page handwritten manuscript. That's what he was writing in Ternate. And he says to Darwin, would you take a look at this? And if you think it's worthy of publication, would you send it off to a journal or recommend a journal that will publish it? So Darwin reads this little paper, and it's just like a précis of his theory of evolution by natural selection. Everything is in there. I mean, natural selection, variation, struggle for existence, it's all in that little account. And he says at the time that his stomach just hit the floor because people have been telling him this. Lyell in particular have been telling him this for years. If you don't do it, somebody's going to beat you to it, and you're going to lose all priority. And so Darwin doesn't know exactly what he should do in this case. And so maybe this is a good point to pause. So we'll take a little cookie break here, and when we come back, we'll tell you what he does, and then we're going to spend most of the next time talking about the origin of species. All right, so let's help poor Darwin on to his book. So Darwin has received this letter. Darwin was a very honorable man, so he doesn't know exactly what he should do. I mean, he knows he has to read the letter and if it's, act honorably about it, but, he's been working on this for 20 years himself, so what is the right thing to do in this case? So he does what a reasonable person would do. He asks the advice of some eminent people. So he tells Charles Lyell, the geologist, and then his good friend Joseph Hooker, he tells them what has happened, that he's received this letter and this manuscript's in there. What is the proper thing for Darwin to do? He asks. So they both tell him, they say, or they ask him first, they say, now is there anything that you have written, a manuscript of any kind, that you've written that outlines your ideas, like this one? And Darwin says, disremembering the sketch, he says, well, there's that essay I wrote in 1844, and Hooker knew about that, so Hooker had seen that. And then there's this letter I wrote last year to this guy in the United States in which I kind of outlined what I was doing. And so, yeah, I've got some stuff. And so what they suggest to Darwin is that he pull from this already written stuff that people have seen, so he's got verification that he actually did this before, that he pull from that about a 4 or 5 page paper, and that he send that paper, Darwin's contrived paper, and Wallace's paper onto a journal, and maybe read it and then get it published. And so that would be kind of honorable. You're publishing the paper, you're also publishing something you've already done at the same time. So that's what happens. On July the 1st, 1858, these joint papers, these 2 papers by Wallace and Darwin, are read before the Linnaean Society of London, a group that had been established about 70 years before. This is a little reenactment photo that Life magazine made on the anniversary of this in 1958. This is the actual manuscript papers, and this is the actual rooms of the Linnaean Society. And so they were read. Darwin was not there because his youngest child had just died. He had a 2-year-old that had never really been healthy and died near the end of June, and so he couldn't go. So these papers are kind of read in absentia. And of course, Wallace isn't there. Wallace is off in the Malay Archipelago. So the papers are read. They're published a little later that year in the Journal of the Proceedings of the Linnaean Society. And so we have this in the library. In fact, we have this on exhibit upstairs. And so here's how it starts. I think I have it a little bigger there. So it says, on the tendency of species to form varieties and on the perpetuation of varieties and species by natural means of selection by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. So notice Charles Darwin is Fellow of the Royal Society, Fellow of the Linnean Society, and Fellow of the Geological Society, and Wallace is Esquire, which he really wasn't, by the way. He wasn't even an Esquire. And then it says, communicated by Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker. So if we turn the page, there's a little introduction that's written by Lyell and Hooker. So they're saying, we've got these two things, we're presenting these. And then there starts off with Darwin's extract from an unpublished work. So that's his little paper. And then when he's done, then there's Wallace's paper on the tendency of varieties to depart indefinitely from the original type. That's the manuscript that Darwin got in the mail. So these two things are read on July the 1st. They're published in the journal. And what's really interesting in the light of what's going to happen in the next year is that nobody notices. I mean, here you go. These are perfectly good outlines of evolution by natural selection, but they're just a couple pages long. And I guess that's just not enough because nobody comes away from this and says, my God, natural history has just been transformed. They don't notice anything at all. And in a famous summation, the president of the society, the one who presided at this meeting, later in the year, presidents always have to give these addresses later in the year when they're supposed to summarize the work of the society. So he does that, and he says, this is one of those years when nothing much happened. Words which will come back to haunt him later on. Now, we often, Wilda.
Darwin's paper was 53 pages long?
No. It was about 5.
Oh.
5. Both of them, the whole thing is maybe 10, 12 pages, something in that order. I should know the exact number, but I don't. Now, we often wonder, Wallace wasn't consulted about this. And Wallace has a lot of sort of admirers today that say, well, Wallace got screwed, and he's really the discoverer of evolution. Darwin waited too long. He shouldn't get any credit at all. And I just thought I'd point out that Wallace never felt that way. Later on, he thought that was indeed the just thing to do. And when Wallace finally publishes his book on the Malay Archipelago, he dedicates it to Darwin. This is in 1869. So if he was fomenting any resentment, it certainly doesn't show there because he really thinks that Darwin is the person who deserves the credit for writing the book on evolution, even if Wallace got the same idea independently. So the other thing that happens as a result of this paper is that Darwin realizes that, well, there's no more putting things off. I can't finish this big book. That's much too big. What I need is a different book. So he sits down and he writes what he calls an abstract on the origin of species. And this is a book that he takes from his big book. But a lot of the big book isn't written, so a lot of it has to be written anew. And he leaves out all the footnotes. He pares it down to a minimum. It's still 400 and some pages long, so there's a lot in there, but most of it that he leaves out. And he writes it in just over a year. So he sits down and he writes that manuscript out in just over a year, and he gives it to his publisher, John Murray, and the book, as you see here, is published on November the 24th of 1859. And it's a brand new book. So it's not the big book. It's something that he's written in the last year, and this is the book that we honor. This is the book we have on display. This is the book that is going to change the world of biology and the world of natural history. So we have a first edition. There were 1,250 copies of this printed, which is a modest enough number, but considering the reception that the paper received, which was no reception before, it's interesting to note that this book sold out on the very first day. It sold mostly to booksellers, so booksellers bought it up so they could resell it, but you had to go into another printing right away. So clearly a book is different from a paper in the eyes of most people. So what we want to do now is talk about how Darwin presents his idea in this book. And I'm going to go into some detail on this because I think it's important to know. You can read this yourself. I put on your sheet, there are lots of editions of The Origin of Species that you can read. The one I suggest is a facsimile of the first edition. That's what my students read, for example, and that's because that's the way it appeared in 1859, and later editions are different. Darwin changes things later on. Just this year, in fact, just a month ago, a new edition has been published of a facsimile called The Annotated Origin, and it's really great. I've just got it myself, and that's the one I put on your list because it's got not only the original first edition, but in the margin it's got all sorts of notes, which sometimes help us because Darwin leaves all the notes out of his first edition. So you can buy that if you wish, or you can just buy the facsimile edition. They're both published by Harvard Press. So suppose it was your task to write an account of a theory that everybody's going to hate. Okay. So how do you go about doing this? And this is what Darwin said. He's had 20 years to think about this. Almost certainly, if you decide to start your book by saying, I have this great new idea. I think species change, and there are no fixed species, and God didn't make anything, and that's the way it is. So you could start that way, and most of your audience would read that page and close the book and throw it away. So the hard thing is to get people to read what you have to say, because otherwise you can't convince anybody. So Darwin's very clever. He starts this book by talking about variation under domestication. That's the title of the first chapter. He talks about domestic animals. And there's not a thing in that first chapter that you can disagree with. So anybody who's reading this, you're not going to come to a point and say, well, that's ridiculous. And so you kind of get lulled into this book in that way. But there's a reason for starting with this variation under domestication. Darwin needs to establish some things that he's going to use when he gets to his theory. He needs to establish, and he does establish in this first chapter, that variations are everywhere. Okay? And that's how animal breeding works. If it weren't for the fact that when sheep reproduce, that all the sheep, the offspring, are a little different, we couldn't breed. Breeding consists of picking out this one and breeding them, and you get something a little different. And if there are no variations, there would be no breeding whatsoever. So variations appear all the time in any kind of an animal in a domestic situation. What causes these variations? Darwin says, we don't know. Maybe the environment causes it. Almost certainly, it's not caused by the animal itself. It doesn't have this will to change. So it's not Lamarckian. It's just something that animals are born with. The variations are there when they're born. They're there to start with. So something causes them, but they seem to be random to Darwin. And that's a good term for them. They're random variations. They're not directed by anything. They just appear. And so what a breeder then does is he selects them. And so Darwin is introducing the notion of selection. It's artificial selection. It's selection by a person. It's not by nature. But he's showing that if you select variations, you can indeed change succeeding generations by simply picking who does the breeding. And then the other thing he establishes in here is that these variations are inherited. You couldn't breed without that. So if you get a pigeon with a little puffy crop here, and you breed it, the offspring will more than likely have this puffy crop. So if variations were not inherited, you couldn't breed animals. So that's all he does in this first chapter. We have variations in nature. These variations are passed on to the offspring, even though we don't know where they came from, and they're selectable. So you can pick them if you want. So it's all neat. You read that and you say, yeah, I knew that already. I didn't even have to read this book to get that. And so Darwin has kind of got you into being a sort of a sympathetic reader. Chapter 2 of this book, and by the way, by the time you read chapter 4, the whole argument has been spelled out. So you now know what evolution by natural selection is. So we just have these 3 chapters to go through. So chapter 2 is much briefer. It's called Variation in Nature. And here Darwin wants to make just one point, that varieties appear in nature just like they do in the barnyard. And a lot of people didn't believe this. I mean, if you go out in the field, you look at the foxes, they're all like the same. You go in the barnyard, there's black sheep and white sheep, and they're all different. So a lot of people thought, well, domestic animals, they just vary, and natural animals, they just don't. And so they got lulled into that. And so Darwin has to make the point that in nature, varieties do appear. We don't see a lot of them, and he'll have to explain that separately, but they're there. If you look at a litter of foxes, and you got 10 foxes there, they're different. One will have white feet, and one will have a bent ear or whatever, but the variations are there. So there's something there to select. So the question of why we don't see as much variety in nature, that's a separate thing, but the varieties are there. So he needs to have variations for evolution to work. So that's what he's trying to establish. And that's all that chapter is about. Chapter 3 is called The Struggle for Existence. So here's where he introduces this idea that he got from Malthus, that in nature there is this war for survival, and that many more things are born than can possibly survive, and so there's this struggle for existence. He says that most of the struggle, he points out very cleverly, is between individuals of the same species. So you got a lot more foxes out there, little ones, than the environment can support, and so most of these foxes are not going to survive long enough to produce offspring. So this is something that most people, we're kind of aware of that. We hear these phrases, but when you go out and walk in the countryside, you don't see, animals killing each other all over the place. It's kind of in the undergrowth, and once animals die, they get kind of cleaned up by themselves. So you don't see this. Nature looks like this happy place, when you go out there. But in fact, 99% of everything doesn't make it to produce offspring. And so Darwin has to establish this sort of unpleasant fact. He does say at the end, if you read Darwin's Origin, I do encourage you. I mean, this is like the great book of the 19th century. He's a very good writer, and he has this way at the end of chapters in particular of kind of, summing things up in a very nice way. And he says, there was a war of nature, but it's really not so bad after all, and it is for a good reason, he says at the end of this, as indeed he will try and point out in the next chapter. Okay, so you've got most of the elements here in the first 3 chapters. So we're going to show you the beginning of chapter 4 here. So chapter 4 is where he introduces this idea of natural selection. And in the beginning of chapter 4, he summarizes what he's done. He said, okay, we have variations. They always appear. They never stop. They're inherited. They can be selected. And so then he says, and I put this phrase, which is not here on this page, but he uses it later on. He says, if this is all true, can we not doubt, he says, that there will occasionally appear variations which are favorable to an animal's survival. So this would be a variation that you had in mind, like if you're a fox, if you're a little faster, better teeth, sharper claws, better camouflage, whatever it is, can we not doubt that some of these variations will give an animal a slight edge in the struggle for existence? And so that's the animal that's going to survive to produce the next generation. So favorable variations will be selected by nature by the sheer fact of their survival, and they will produce the next generation, and that next generation is going to inherit that trait, whatever it was. So the next generation is going to be different. And that's all natural selection is. It's simply nature's selection of favorable variations to produce a generation that is slightly different than the one that came before. And that's the simple idea. And so he presents it all. By the time you read chapter 4, you've got the idea presented. Darwin also says in chapter 4 that if this happens over thousands of generations, that we'll get varieties, and these varieties will become species, and these species will become genera. In fact, there's no reason why we can't produce any type of an animal by this simple process of nature selecting favorable variations to produce the next generation. Chapter 6 is interesting. I just want to mention it briefly because we don't have a lot of time here. But usually when you write a book and there's some flaws in your argument or some things you can't explain, you usually kind of ignore those because you don't want to tell people, well, there's actually a real good objection you could make to my theory, so you don't bring it up. Darwin brings it up. This is in chapter 6. He's got a chapter called Objections to My Theory. And so he brings up all the things that people are going to say when they read his first 4 chapters. And one of the things that people are going to say is, what about the eye? The eye is this wonderful designed mechanism. It's very complex. The eye is able to take rays of light and focus them and turn these into nerve impulses, and it's like a little camera, only it's better than a camera, which people now have. And so does that not indicate design? Surely you couldn't produce an eye by some sort of random variation, right? So an eye requires a designer. So Darwin says that. He says, seems like this is an insuperable objection to my idea of evolution by natural selection. And then very cleverly he says, and these pictures are not from his book. There are no pictures in his book except for a diagram, so I stuck these from elsewhere. He says, yeah, that would be a good objection, except for the fact that we find in nature all these intermediary things. For example, we find organisms that have single cells that are receptive to light. And then we have organisms that have little groups of cells that are receptive to light. They don't have an eye, but they've got light receptive cells. And then we've got organisms that have kind of eyes. They don't have a pupil or anything, but they've got collections of cells and a little recess, and that seems to be an advantage. So we got all these things between no eye and the modern eye. And then he says, is it not possible, he often says, is it not possible that since we've got all the intermediary stages that natural selection could produce this, that an organism could appear with a cell that is receptive to light, and that's an advantage, and so it survives and it produces offspring, and then later on another variation would allow for a complex of cells. So is it not possible that since we have this whole gradation, that you could ultimately, over millions of generations, produce the eye? He says, to me, it doesn't seem impossible. And that's sort of the best he can say. Before it seems impossible, now it doesn't. He said, if we had nothing but a blind organism and an organism with an eye, it would be impossible. But we got everything in between. Why couldn't evolution have produced each of these stages if we have enough time? All right, so by the time you read that and you read the objections thing, you know what evolution is, and now the question is, why should you believe it? What does it explain that fixity of species does not explain? So the last chapters, from about chapter 7 to 14, that's the last chapter, Darwin devotes to addressing this. And I'm put images in from books of the period. Again, there are no pictures in the book itself. I just want to show you the kind of thing that he thinks makes sense. And the major thrust of Darwin all through these chapters is that evolution by natural selection makes sense of things. You can't prove evolution in the way you can prove some sort of physical theory, but you can show that it has explanatory power. It makes sense of something. And that's what he's trying to do. So he says, let's talk about the fossil record. Now, everybody knew that the fossil record looks something like this, that we have this series of rocks, and in the lower rocks we have simple organisms, and then we have more complex ones, reptiles, and then we've got mammals sort of at the top. And people account for this in various ways. And Darwin says, if evolution is true, this is just what you'd expect. I mean, he's arguing that life starts out very simply, and so the original forms on Earth are going to be simple forms. And then very gradually, vertebrates will appear, simple vertebrates. And then the vertebrates will move on to land and become land vertebrates and become reptiles. And so if evolution is true, you'd expect a fossil record that looks exactly like this. A record where early rocks have invertebrates, and intermediate rocks have reptiles but no mammals or birds, and then later rocks have mammals, but mammals that are extinct. And then modern rocks have, the modern Earth has mammals that still survive. So the fossil record is perfectly consistent with the notion of evolution. That's his point. You can't prove it because other people can explain it. Cuvier said, well, God destroyed the world here, and then he made this world, and then he made this world and this world, and he just did so progressively. You can say that, and you can believe it, but Darwin's saying, it really makes much more sense if this all happened continuously, and it does fit in with his idea of evolution. What about these famous Galapagos Islands? How do you explain that? So Darwin has a big section, a whole chapter in the book about oceanic islands. And the odd thing to remember about oceanic islands is that they have very peculiar populations of animals. They've got very few animals. The animals are mostly unique to that little set of islands. And very often you'll have one animal that's overrepresented, like finches. You've got a lot of finches on the Galapagos. So how do you explain this? Well, Darwin says, on the idea of the fixity of species, you simply say that, well, God chose to make 13 kinds of finches and put them on that island and no place else. That was his divine prerogative. So you can say that. Darwin says, here's what I think happened. He says, I think the Galapagos Islands didn't used to have any animals at all. They're recent islands, and so those animals got there from South America. So they had to float there on vegetation. If they could swim, they swam there. But not many animals are going to get there. And the few that get there then are going to have this entire landscape that they can now populate. Any variation will be favorable there. There's no competition. And so the ones that get there are going to vary and become these unique species. So iguanas float there. They become their own kinds of iguanas. Tortoises float there. Mammals don't float there. Mammals don't float so well. And so there are no mammals on the Galapagos. Just what you'd expect if they were populated from South America. The finches flew there. Probably, he says, there was a flock of finches, ordinary finches, that were blown there some distant time in the past. And these finches then had this whole island to themselves, this set of islands, and they varied. So if they got little beaks, they could survive, whereas on the mainland, little beak finches wouldn't survive. Big beaks can survive, any beak can survive on the Galapagos Islands, and so they simply diverge and vary and become these separate species. Why finches? No reason. Could have been any bird. Could have been sparrows, in which case these would be Darwin sparrows. But whatever flock gets there, that's going to be the one that is able to then vary and populate the island. Taxonomy. Darwin's got a lot to say about this, and this is one of the stronger arguments for evolution by natural selection. I mean, why is it that we can group all these animals the way Linnaeus did? Why do we have all these carnivores, this family of carnivores? Why do they have so many things in common? Why do all animals, have the standard makeup of 4 legs and sort of 5 fingers? Why can we group animals the way we do? Well, Darwin says if animals evolve, like if all these carnivores descend from a common ancestor, then they ought to have common traits, just like you look like your grandparents. I mean, it ought to be that these animals resemble their ancestors, and so you'd expect to be able to classify everything into these natural groups if evolution occurred. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, why, if God just made all these animals this way, why did he make them as if they were in families, and as if they were in orders? Why do you do that? There's no reason. Whereas if these animals really have a common ancestor, then their affinities, their resemblances make a great deal of sense. In that vein, Darwin talks a great deal in the later chapters about comparative anatomy. Again, one of the strong arguments for evolution. Everybody knew, he doesn't have to discover this, everybody knew, like Richard Owen knew, that there's a very uncanny resemblance in the organs of many animals, organs that have entirely different functions. Organs that are similar in their structure but different in function were called by naturalists homologous organs. So Darwin doesn't invent that term. Owen uses that term. So this, for example, this is from a book published in the 1860s. This shows a human hand and the fin of a porpoise, I think, and the wing of a bat. So these are all mammals you see in here. So why is it that organs which have such different functions, grasping, swimming, flying, why do they have one bone in their upper arm, 2 bones in their lower arm, a little set of wrist bones, and 5 fingers? But why this resemblance in structure? Well, you can explain it without evolution. You can say, well, God just made a prototype of a vertebrate in his mind, an ideal vertebrate, and then he just did a theme and variations on this. So he just it pleased him to make animals that have different functions but similar structure. Darwin says there's another way to explain this. These animals all have a common ancestor. That ancestor was a tetrapod. It was a 4-legged, 5-fingered animal, and all his descendants are going to inherit that trait. So the fact that we find these homologous organs everywhere in nature suggests, again, common ancestry. It just makes sense. Keep saying that. It makes sense this way. It explains things if these all have common ancestors. And finally, the world of embryology. This is something Darwin doesn't do himself. He's not an embryologist. This is mostly a German pursuit. And in the 1840s and the 1850s, lots of scientists were discovering what happens when organisms develop in the embryo. And this is from a book of the late 1860s and shows you that these are in German. So this is a Mensch. This is us. And here's a cow and a pig and a chicken and a turtle and a fish over here. And so by the time these things are born, they're quite different. But when they start out, they're identical. You can't even tell them apart. Why is that? So why do all embryos sort of start out with the same basic form, and then they develop in the womb, they develop these distinguishing characteristics? It doesn't make much sense on the theme of special creation, but if all organisms have a common ancestor, it's not surprising. It's not so surprising that they would share these embryological traits themselves. So for Darwin, evolution by natural selection makes a certain sense of embryology. So by the time you're done with the book, you've been confronted with the argument and you've been confronted with the evidence. And so now there is the question of closing the book and deciding what to make of all this. We aren't going to have time, and I didn't expect we'd have time to talk too much about the reaction of lots of people to this book. The course and the exhibit kind of ends with the book, but I want to give you one reaction and then say something relevant to that. The most famous reaction to Darwin's book is the reaction of Thomas Henry Huxley, who was a noted anatomist and an ancestor of lots of modern Huxleys. Aldous Huxley is a great-grandson or a grandson of Thomas Henry. He was an acquaintance of Darwin's before Darwin wrote The Origin. He kind of knew what Darwin was doing, but he didn't subscribe to it. He was a believer in the fixity of species. And Darwin sent him a copy of his book and a presentation copy. He sent about 20 people personal copies, because people he wanted to read the book. And if someone gives you a book, you're more likely to feel you have to read it than if you go buy it. So that's a very clever thing to do. So he gave one to Huxley, and Huxley got the book on November whenever it was that he got it. He may have had some pre-publication copies. Anyway, he gets the book, and he reads it that night. I want you to remember that. If you buy the book and read it, that night. So that's quite a thing. And he says to himself after he read the book, he said, "How stupid of me not to have thought of that." So that's a wonderful reaction. It's not typical, okay, but it's wonderful because that's the kind of book it was. That is, if you're open-minded, as Huxley was, it's all in there. And you read it as one continuous argument, which is the way Darwin wrote it. He sat down and wrote it continuously. And you come away and say, it all fits into place. Suddenly nature makes sense for Huxley. And he becomes a convert immediately. And so it can have that effect on people. There are a lot of people that read it, and even they do read the whole thing, reject it because of their belief that it can't be. That this belief in the fixity of species is a very deep belief amongst naturalists, and so it's hard. It's going to be hard for a lot of people to give it up. I'm going to. I have time to mention this. Since we've introduced Huxley, I want to talk about a famous event that took place in 1860. When Darwin's book came out in the fall of 1859, it was immediately reviewed in all the major literary journals. And Huxley wrote a review, for example, a very favorable review. But lots of people wrote reviews that were not favorable, like Richard Owen and some other people said that it's not an argument. They simply said it's not science. It's a clever idea, but it's not an acceptable type of a hypothesis. But so the book's becoming quite well known, at least among scientific circles. And so in 1860, in June of 1860, there was a meeting of the British Association of the Advancement of Science in Oxford, and they decided to have a special program on the Saturday there, a special session devoted to the origin of species. I don't know if they invited Darwin, but he didn't go, and he wouldn't have gone. Darwin doesn't go out, okay? So there's nobody really there to defend it. So they have a bunch of speakers they invite in. It's a whole morning thing, and they have a speaker. It's like 300 people are in the audience for this. And Huxley, Thomas Huxley, who was known as not particularly known as a Darwinian, because he hadn't been for very long, he was there at the meeting, and the organizer of the meeting said, well, you're not on the program, but you've written a nice review. Why don't you come up on the stage, and you can be there, and you can take part in the proceedings. So the proceedings go on. Lots of people talk and drone on, and in the nice fashion that the British have, which we don't have. We're so polite over here. The first speaker, an American, gets booed off the stage. They said, get out of here. You don't know what you're talking about. So, but lots of people did. And one of the speakers was this guy. So this is a bishop in the Anglican Church. This is Samuel Wilberforce, who was a very gifted orator and a pretty intelligent fellow. And Wilberforce had been coached by Richard Owen for this occasion to talk about the religious objections to Darwin's origin. So he got up and spoke, and Huxley's there. He's like Huxley's there, and Wilberforce is here. And Huxley doesn't know what he's supposed to be doing. I mean, you can't refute religious arguments just by saying, well, you don't like it. So he's not sure what he's going to do. Fortunately, Wilberforce, as kind of his concluding remark, turns to Huxley and says, as a conclusion, finally, might I ask, my good sir, whether it is through your grandfather or your grandmother that you trace your descent from a monkey? So, well, everybody sits up at that. And so Huxley gets up, and Huxley now says, I know what I'm going to do. So Huxley gets up, and he gives a very reasoned defense. What Wilberforce didn't really understand evolution, so Huxley tries to correct the misimpressions that they got. And then he says, in conclusion, he says, and finally, I might say, as to the question of whether it is through my grandfather or my grandmother, I just trace my descent from an ape. He says, if I had to choose between an ape for a miserable ape, he says, if I had to choose between a miserable ape for a grandfather or a man of great learning and erudition who so misuses his gifts to introduce ridicule into a scientific discussion, I unhesitatingly affirm for the ape. So that was it. So this is a great event, and so the crowd goes wild, and all the undergraduates stamp their feet, and all the women faint in a good Victorian fashion. And it's an important event, actually, because this is what brings Darwin into the public sphere. I mean, before this, Darwin was reviewed in scientific journals, and nobody really knew what he was doing. And now it becomes a public event, as it really has been ever since. Now, the big problem, the problem under the surface with Darwinian evolution, is not that it doesn't explain things, because you can see its explanatory power. The problem with Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is that it undermines the notion that the universe has been designed, that the world has been designed. So that's the problem, and Darwin recognizes this. Nearly everyone in 1859 believed that when you looked at nature, you're looking at the product of design, and therefore you're looking at the product of a designer, namely God. Now, natural selection, Darwin's theory of evolution, is a blind process. There's no design in it. So things appear at random, and then the ones that survive, and they produce the next generation, and a marvelous world has been built. But there's no design in it. There's no room in this universe for a God that has designed every little thing. There's room for a God that's designed the principles of life, for the laws of nature, but there's not room for this immanent creator of every little thing. So that's the problem that a lot of people have with it. And a lot of people find that objectionable. Darwin didn't. And I want to conclude by reading you the last paragraph of The Origin of Species, because it shows you how you can sort of understand and accept evolution and accept it not as a bad thing, because Darwin didn't think it is. So this is the very last paragraph of Darwin's book. And I wish I should have, actually it's a good thing I don't have a photograph, because I want you to listen to me and not read it on the screen. So here's what Darwin says. He says, "It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and dependent on each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. These laws, taken in the largest sense, being growth with reproduction, inheritance, variability from the indirect and direct action of the external conditions of life, a ratio of increase so high as to lead to a struggle for life, and as a consequence to natural selection, entailing divergence of character and the extinction of less improved forms. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the productions of the higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Thank you.